Welcome to the Rachel's English Podcast. I'm so glad to have you here. It's my goal that you would listen to this podcast every week and be able to understand Americans better and to feel better about your American English accent and conversation skills. If you need a copy of the transcript of this podcast, just visit rachelsenglish.com/podcast and look for this episode. It's absolutely free to download. This podcast goes with a video that just got published on my YouTube channel it was a vocabulary builder video on family relationships. David, you didn't get to see that one yet. It just came out yesterday.
No, I haven't even seen it yet.
But actually, a lot of your family is in that. You're in that video.
Yeah, I remember when we shot it, and it seemed like it was going to be great.
Yeah, I shot it when we were all on vacation with David's family at the beach back in June. And we talk about things like sister, mother-in-law, cousin, and I actually draw out a family tree. So we go over a lot of terms in that video, and I will link to that video in the show notes to this podcast. So it's not necessary to have seen it before listening to this podcast, but it might be worth a watch. A couple of terms that I didn't go over in that video, I wanted to go over in the podcast. And I talked about cousins and, all of Stoney's cousins in that video, but I didn't talk about second cousins. So I should have taken my camera to Michigan, where we were hanging out with all of my cousins. So that meant that their children and my child were second cousins. So second cousins are people whose parents are first cousins. And first cousins are people whose parents are siblings. Now, if I'm talking about my first cousin, Nicole, and I'm talking about her children, so to Stoney, they're second cousins, but what are they to me? To me, they are first cousins once removed. So the children of any of your cousins are once removed. The grandchildren of your cousins are twice removed. So if Gina ever has a kid, then that kid will be my first cousin twice removed. We're getting really complicated with the family tree here. Some people are really into that. I have an uncle on both sides that are so into the family tree. And, if you meet somebody, they can tell you, oh, he's your fourth cousin once removed or whatever. He knows everything about how you're related to everyone else. David, do you have any family tree buffs, family history buffs in the family?
I don't know if they're as major as your two uncles. Your two uncles are pretty impressive.
Really?
Shout out to Uncle John and Uncle Frank.
Yeah. Uncle John has pulled out this family tree once that's just massive. I mean, I don't know how. And it's so hard to organize. When you're dealing with many generations and you're trying to map them out on a family tree, I think it's really hard.
Yeah. So no one on my side, I think, is quite that good, although my mom is really good. She has a really good sense of her extended family.
Yeah. Yeah. Back in the generation of our parents and our grandparents, there were so many more children born than now. So it's just like so many more people to keep track of then too. Okay, so those are two terms, first cousins, second cousins, and the once removed. Another term that I didn't bring up that's really common is I didn't bring up the term ex. So when you're married and then you get divorced, then that person is your ex-husband or your ex-wife, and you can just shorten it to ex. And I have to, my kid is at my ex's house, so I'm going to go pick him up.
Right.
And then also you could use the term ex to apply to my ex-father-in-law or my ex-mother-in-law. So that's one other term I left off when I was going over that video. As I was thinking about this podcast, I was thinking about my own family, and my family feels really spread out. Marion's in California, Eleanor's in Atlanta, John's in Indiana. My parents are in Florida, Colorado, and even just my nuclear family. My parents are in Florida and Colorado. I'm in Pennsylvania, and my brother's in Texas. I mean, we have to fly hours to see each other. And I wonder if that's common or if it's just because the U.S. is so big.
Common in other cultures, you mean?
Yeah, to be that far apart from your family.
Yeah, I wonder too.
I think it's less common in other cultures, in other countries.
My guess is that that's probably accurate. Mm-hmm.
I remember I was traveling somewhere. I can't remember where I was, but there was a Swiss couple and we were talking about where I'm from in the US. And I forget what exactly I was saying. At the time, I lived in Boston, and I used to go to New York City for voice lessons. It's about a 4.5 hour drive. I would go once a week. And I remember talking to them, and I said, "Oh, it's not that bad. It's 4.5 hours." And they were like, "Whoa. If we drove 4.5 hours, we'd be like 2 countries away," or something like that. Like, to them, a 4.5 hour drive felt
Right.
massive.
Mhm.
Whereas in the US, like, that's nothing.
Right.
I grew up in Florida, and we used to go to vacation in Michigan, and we would drive straight as 24 hours because the speed limit used to be slower. And we would just leave and not stop until we got where we were going. Not safe. I would not do that now. I need to sleep. So, one story that I think is funny about the names we use to call people, this is my cousin, this is my aunt, whatever. I was traveling in Kenya and Tanzania with my aunt and uncle. And my uncle had spent quite a bit of time there as a medical professional. And so he knew the culture much better than I did, or much better than my aunt did. And as he would introduce me, he would say, "This is my daughter, Rachel." And he said, they don't really use niece and nephew here so much that, like, kind of everyone would just be called or considered a daughter. And he would say this, and then he would immediately get this weird look on his face. And I could tell that he was so uncomfortable calling me his daughter. Like, he wanted to be like, "She's not really my daughter." But he was doing it because, it was a more normal way where he was to describe that kind of relationship.
Well, such a great example of being culturally aware of learning from the people around you about where you are and then doing it that way versus, needing to be sort of a little bit more closed off and I need to do it the way I do it.
Yeah. I mean, it was funny for me too to be called his daughter, because in America, there's a real strong sense that I'm not his daughter. I'm his niece. Another thing that I was thinking of about the words we use for family members. In the video, I went over grandma and grandpa, which are obviously very common ways to call the parents of your parents. But then I was thinking about lots of people in the US have come up with alternative terms for this. Like, I know a lot of people will call their grandma Nana, or I know someone who calls her grandma Gigi, and Pawpaw for grandpa. So definitely there are lots of names that have been developed. And I like the idea because, each kid has 2 sets of grandparents, mom's parents and dad's parents. And if they're both called grandma and grandpa, that can be confusing. Like with Stony right now, he's old enough to kind of start to know what words mean, but young enough, I think, to still be really confused about these 2 sets of people both being called grandma and grandpa. What do you think?
It actually doesn't seem so weird to me because that's the way that I grew up. Both of my sets of grandparents, I just, it was grandpa and grandma last name. And so that seems normal to me for him.
Yeah, for me too, but just at this age yet where he's still so young that I'm not sure he quite gets it. Like when I say, "Let's call grandma and grandpa," I don't know. I just feel like even if I said the last name, he would still be confused about who I was actually going to call. I sort of wish my parents would have said, "Okay, we can be called," and then made up their own little names. So then it would be really clear in Stoney's head who was who. But I know eventually, as he gets a little bit older, it will become crystal clear to him. David, so you're saying you called your grandparents grandma last name, grandpa last name.
Right.
What other names for grandma or grandpa have you heard of?
Grammy.
Yeah, I was thinking of that one too.
Pop.
P-O-P.
Nana, you said. Nanny. Pop for grandpa.
Gramps. I feel like I've called my grandpa that before, although it's also sort of a derogatory term to use for an older man.
It's got an edge to it.
So anyway, grandma and grandpa can be expanded. A couple of idioms came up in that video, and I thought, I bet there are a lot of interesting family idioms involving family relationships. So I did a little research and found a couple. The idiom like father, like son. Or I think it could also be like mother, like daughter. It could also be like father, like daughter. It's just relating people from 2 different generations.
Oh, that's interesting, though. No one ever says like father, like daughter.
But I think it could be said, though, and it wouldn't seem strange.
Yeah, I suppose you're right, but I do think that it's not used that way very often.
Definitely the most common iteration would be like father, like son.
Hmm.
What's that mean?
That means that someone has noticed that the son is doing something that is exactly like the father. Um,
Hmm. Or
might be
maybe looks exactly like the father.
yeah, maybe. Hmm. Or a little, just a little character trait, or maybe walks the same way. That's one of mine
Oh
with my
gosh.
father. We
Yeah.
walk exactly the same. And then one of my friends was cracking up because Stony walks exactly like both of us.
Yeah.
So we're just like father, like son.
Yep. So it would be like an example is if someone's father was a lawyer and now he was wanting to be a lawyer, you could say, oh, he wants to be a lawyer, like father, like son.
There's a similar idiom that's a chip off the old block.
Oh, yeah, that's a great idiom. Means the exact same thing.
Hmm.
A child is very similar to a parent, either in appearance or in habit or in personality.
Or the apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
Another idiom meaning the same thing. Those are both great idioms, David. Thanks for thinking of those.
Hmm.
What about the phrase, not your father's blank? Have you heard this?
No, what are you trying to say?
Well, like if someone's trying to say that something is new, has been innovated, is
Oh,
different from
right.
the way it's always been,
Hmm.
they might say, yeah, this is not your father's. Let me come up with an example. All right, let's say that you need a lawnmower and the salesman is trying to sell you this like really fancy one that's got all of these features. And you might be thinking, oh my gosh, is it worth that price tag? He might say, you know what, David? This is not your father's lawnmower.
Right. Implying that things have progressed so far, the
Gotten
innovation
better.
is so much better that
Yeah.
it's worth it.
Yes. So the implication, not your father's, implies that it's gotten better. Maybe it's been innovated.
It's technologically advanced.
Yeah. It's
Hmm.
improved a lot over time,
Hmm.
drastically.
Hmm. Another example might be cars. So if you're buying a new car and someone's trying to talk you into it, someone might say, again, this is kind of like a salesman idea, but this is not your father's station wagon. Like right away, that brings up an image for me. We had this old station wagon and it was pretty bare bones and there was not a lot technologically advanced with it. But then when you and I were shopping for a car and we knew we weren't going to get that one car, but we let them talk us into a test ride anyway. And that was like, this is not your father's station wagon. That was like a spaceship. That
It
thing
was
was
an
amazing.
amazing ride. It was
Yeah.
a super Outback, which we did not buy, but
Yeah.
we wished we could.
Yeah. And that was not your father's station wagon.
That is not your father's station wagon. Have you heard the phrase mama's boy?
Yep.
This is a negative term. You don't want to be called a mama's boy, wouldn't you say?
Correct.
Yeah. A mama's boy would be a boy or a man who's still attached to his mother in a way that is outside of what would be developmentally normal.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, a man who might still make a lot of his decision based on what his mother wants.
Yeah. I mean, it's a biting term. It's not, you wouldn't really use it casually. I guess you could if you really knew someone well and you were wanting to poke at them a little bit, but it's got an edge to it.
Yeah, but like if you're hanging out with some people and some dude's mom is calling and she calls them up frequently, you might say, oh, mama's boy, your phone's ringing.
Yeah.
So you could use it
No,
casually
you're right.
too.
It can be playful, but you should know the person pretty well.
Yeah. The mother lode. What do you think of when you hear this term?
Well, I know how to use it. I know what it means, but I don't know what it comes from. It means a big bunch of something, or the ultimate discovery of a huge amount of something. Though I don't know what is a mother lode.
I'm not sure.
But you think I'm using it correctly.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the definition, a large supply of something. For example, let's say that we're, going through my parents' attic looking for stuff. And I, in particular, as we go through their things, maybe I'm hoping to find old family photos. We find a couple here, we find a couple there. Let's say we open a box that's full of thousands of family photos. I might say, oh, the mother lode, here it is. Or when I was younger, I grew up in Florida and we used to go to these streams, these creeks in our neighborhood and look for shark's teeth that were left behind from, millennia ago when Florida was underwater. That probably wasn't even millennia ago. Anyway, we would look for shark's teeth, and every once in a while you'd find one and it'd be lucky. And maybe one time you found a particular area of the stream where you found like 5 or 10 right there. You might say, oh, the mother lode, look at how many I just got. Have you ever heard the term swear on your mother's grave?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What's it mean?
That means you are really, you swear that what you're about to say is absolutely true.
Right.
You wouldn't dare stand on your mother's grave and lie.
Right. When you swear on your mother's grave, it's like an extra step saying this is 100% the truth.
Yeah.
And of course, that person could still be lying. But it's just a way to try to make them feel even more guilty for lying if they're lying.
Right.
Have you ever heard the phrase everyone and their mother, or everyone and their brother, everyone and their sister, everyone and their cousin?
Right. That's a good one. That one gets used a lot.
Yeah. What's it mean?
Means just a huge amount of people.
A big crowd.
So everyone and their mother was there.
Right.
It implies it's crowded, almost implies like overcrowded and too full.
Yeah, actually last week, David went to drop off our friend in Center City and was driving back. And there was this huge concert that was just this past weekend, the Made in America concert, and Jay-Z was there. And it was in downtown Philadelphia. And David kept texting me and saying, nope, worse traffic, even more traffic than I thought, kept adding on time to when he would be home. And that was like everyone and their mother was trying to drive through Center City at that time.
Exactly.
Traffic was so bad.
Yeah, it was terrible.
And I didn't go to the concert, but I have a feeling that everyone and their mother was there.
Yeah, it was a huge, huge sprawling concert.
I think it was probably packed. David, didn't you read recently in the New Yorker about a restaurant that you wanted to try? It was a table for two. It was in the table for two column.
Yeah.
And you immediately called to make a table, but everyone and their mother had already done that, and there were no reservations.
That's exactly right.
That's sad.
We'll go sometime.
What was the name? Do you remember?
I don't remember, but it was a fish. The specialty was fish, and I knew that you would like it.
Yeah. Speaking of, we're going to New York this weekend and don't have any plans yet. We got to get on that.
Yeah, we do.
Make some reservations.
Got to get on that.
Got to get on that. That means something we really need to start working on. You kiss your mother with that mouth? Have you ever heard that phrase?
Mm-hmm.
That's just something that someone might say to someone who cusses a lot.
Yeah, right. And the image that comes up for me is someone older admonishing someone younger after they've overheard them using a cuss word. Yeah, you kiss your mother with that mouth. That's a good rebuke.
Yeah. When you cuss, then someone might say you have a dirty mouth.
Right.
Yeah. And so then also comes the idea of you wouldn't kiss your mother with a dirty mouth.
Right.
What about using brother for friends rather than your actual brother? Do you ever do that?
The word, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, some. I say bro a lot.
Oh, yeah. Shortening brother to BRO.
Yeah. I also use that for my brothers-in-law. Brother's kind of formal. I don't often use that.
But what about like, what's up, brother?
No, I know. Some people do. I'm saying for me, I haven't ever used that very much.
But it's definitely a thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also a thing to use sister for women, female friends. She's my sister. She's always there for me.
Yep, you're right.
I'm trying to think if I would ever shorten that to sis. I don't think I would the way you shorten brother to bro.
I think you're probably right.
But probably some people do.
I say sis to a couple of my really good friends that are women.
You do?
Mm-hmm.
Who?
Krista, I say that to sometimes, and Yannickin.
Okay. What about the phrase big brother or big brother is watching you?
Oh, right.
Do, do, do.
Yeah.
You don't want that.
Ominous.
Mm-hmm.
So what's that mean?
Well, I think it comes from George Orwell's novel 1984. I think that was the first time that the term big brother was coined. Have you read that book?
I haven't. I would
Oh,
like
really?
to.
Okay. I think I read it twice. I think I read it once for high school, but that's so long ago I don't remember. But then I also read it when I was older and I was a tutor for a high schooler. Then we read it together. Anyway, it's about a government, an overreaching government ruling party that is basically spying on, invading the privacy of its citizens. So the idea that Big Brother is watching you is the idea that the government is keeping tabs on what you're doing. For example, in the US, I can't remember if the law did end up passing. I think it did, but where a lot of the data for when you're surfing online or this kind of thing can now be sold, can now be watched and sold. Um, and so that's sort of the idea of, oh, does the government have the right to go through and watch where you are on the internet? Maybe, maybe not.
Right.
But that's the idea. If you feel like the government is able to sort of follow your actions online or elsewhere, then the idea is Big Brother is watching you.
Right.
There was a TV show, I think it was on CBS, called Big Brother for a while, where it was like a group of people living in a house.
Reality TV,
Yeah.
right, where people got kicked out.
And they were being videotaped, which I guess that was the
I
idea
guess
of
that
Big
was the
Brother.
thing, right? There was
Yeah.
video everywhere.
Man, for a while there, I guess still, but reality TV just took off.
It did.
Such a huge thing. I'm glad it's subsided a little bit because I think it's pretty boring.
Agreed.
What about the phrase, I'm not my brother's keeper, or am I my brother's keeper?
Or I'm my brother's keeper. Sometimes it's embraced in the positive too. This idea about whether or not you're responsible for someone else. You're a close friend, and should you or should you not be held responsible for things that person does or says?
Like, let's say you're out with somebody and you're out with a group of friends one night and one of your friends gets in a fight and maybe he gets pretty beat up. Someone else might say to you, David, why didn't you stop that? Why didn't you stop him? And then you could say, I'm not my brother's keeper. He made up his mind. It's what he wanted to do. It wasn't up to me.
Right. The implication that they are responsible for their actions.
Not you.
Right.
Right. That comes from the Bible, doesn't it? I think it does come from the Bible. The story of Cain and Abel. Learned that a long time ago. Okay, the grandfather clause. Great term involving a family relationship word. Or to be grandfathered in. Both of them mean the same thing. If there is a grandfather clause, then you could be grandfathered in. And this just means that you don't have to follow a rule that applied to you after you had already done something. Okay, this is confusing. Let's give an example.
So an example is, as a therapist, the clinical license law changed maybe 8 or 10 years ago. And so in order to receive a clinical license, there was new legislation that said you had to get a certain amount of supervision and submit those hours in a certain way and was really specific. But for people who already had their clinical license before the time of that legislation, they were grandfathered in to the new program, meaning that they didn't have to do anything else in order to keep their license.
Yeah, that's a great example. So it's when a new restriction doesn't apply to somebody who has already achieved something or is already at a certain level.
Mm-hmm.
Another example, if a rate goes up for a membership, for example, Rachel's English Academy, the first week, if people signed up, the rate was $10. Now it's $14. So even though the rate went up, everyone who signed in during that first week is grandfathered in at that rate. So they will always only pay that rate. They got grandfathered in at the original price. Have you ever heard, say uncle?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a little old-fashioned.
Yeah, where does that come from?
I don't know.
That means stop.
Yeah, that means like if you're it's always physical, right? If someone's hurting you, if you're kind of fighting with somebody, say uncle means I give up, stop.
Right, I give up. Right. Mm-hmm.
I always think of this scene in the movie The Christmas Story where the bullies are beating up the kids in like an alley. Do you remember this?
Mm-mm.
And the bully's like, say uncle. And the kid's like, uncle. Anyway, great clip. I will link to that in the show notes of this episode.
All right, I'll make sure to watch that. Uncle
Sam. Who's that uncle?
That would be the United States government.
Yeah. It's funny that has become a nickname for the government of the United States. I'm giving all my money to Uncle Sam.
Complaining about taxes.
Yeah, right. So I did a little research into this. It became the nickname back in 1813, more or less. And the name is linked to a man named Samuel Wilson, who is supplying food to the United States Army.
Okay.
And the barrels with this food was stamped U.S. for United States. And the soldiers started calling it Uncle Sam.
Because of the abbreviation.
Yeah, and he was providing them with food.
Okay.
So sort of maybe that's where the idea of uncle came in. And so it eventually spread and became a general nickname for the U.S. federal government. And there's this iconic poster. Like there's a figure, a cartoon drawing of Uncle Sam that has sort of been adapted as the picture of what Uncle Sam looks like.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
And there's a poster, an iconic poster with him pointing, saying Uncle Sam wants you, as a recruiting poster for the Army.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll link to that image in the show notes to this podcast.
Right.
David, I don't know that I can think of any more idioms that use family relationship terms right now. Can you think of anything more?
I don't think so.
If we think of anything more, we'll just have to do another podcast.
That's right.
Okay, guys. So this podcast was a companion podcast to the Family Relationships Vocabulary Builder video that appeared on my YouTube channel. And again, I will link to that video in the show notes to this podcast. Thank you for joining me and listening. David, thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
Don't forget, if you want a transcript to this podcast, just go to rachelsenglish.com/podcast and search for this episode. If you're not already subscribed to the podcast, please do. It's a great way to make sure that you hear every episode. You can do this at iTunes or Stitcher. And I would love it if you would leave a review for me on one of these two platforms. I read all of the reviews, and I love to hear what you think about the Rachel's English podcast.